Hello, I've been a Beatles fan for more than 50 years, and the film yesterday got me going back through the back catalogue of all the Beatles songs, and I must say they're as fresh and as brilliant as they always were. And of course, here is my Bible, which is the complete scores of the Beatles, every song they wrote and recorded between 1960 and 1970. More than 1,000 manuscripts here, which is ironic because the Beatles never learned how to read and write. Not in the traditional sense, they couldn't write notation, they simply wrote their lyrics down on the back of cigarette packets and recorded some of their songs on very old tape machines, took them into the studio, and the fifth Beatle, George Martin, the producer, would make sense of these lyrics and melodies. But let's start with Yesterday, one of the greatest songs ever written, recorded by well over 1,000 different artists throughout the world. Paul McCartney says he dreamt it. He dreamt it, and then he raced, when he woke up, he raced downstairs to his piano and played it several times so he wouldn't forget it. Did he? I'm not so sure. I can remember some dreams, but could I remember a melody for a verse and a chorus? I'm not so sure I could. I think it's more likely that he was half asleep, half awake, and he sort of put this song together in his head. But still, great story. And when he went into the studio, he asked the other Beatles to listen to the melody and said, "Do you recognise it?" Because he half believed that he may have plagiarised this song. He may have heard it somewhere, and like people do, and thought, but of course it was completely unique, and it was the first Beatles song where no other Beatle actually played on it or contributed to it. So Paul actually wrote it. He sang it in the studio on his own with the string quartet and acoustic guitar, and the other Beatles were not involved at all, although John Lennon got a writing credit for it. But the Beatles at that time agreed whoever wrote whatever, they would put both would put their names on it, and at the time they were friends and it worked together and it was fine. A Hard Day's Night was the Beatles' first film. Wasn't the best film ever made, but it was a lot of fun, and it became an album and a top selling single, of course. And it suggested that Ringo was the person who came up with the title. Somebody asked him, said, "Look, how are you, Ringo? What's your day been like?" And he said, "Oh, it's been a hard day's night." And Dick Lester, the producer of the movie, heard about this allegedly and said, "Yep, that's the title." And of course, it became the title of the album and the single. It's probably true. It's probably a fact. "P.S. I Love You" was one of Paul McCartney's early songs. He wrote it in Hamburg when the Beatles were there in the clubs in 1962. The story goes that he used to write home to his girlfriend, who he missed in Liverpool, and he would write "P.S. I Love You," like people do at the end of the letters. And this is how the song was created. The song became the flip side, the B-side of "Love Me Do," the first Beatles hit. But it's a myth. Paul McCartney said many times that's not true. He said, "I just wrote it about general letters, how you at the end say, 'Oh, I forgot something, P.S.' And this is why he wrote the song." So it's a bit of a myth, but I like the other one better. I like the fact that maybe he was writing to his girlfriend. Later, when the Beatles were experimenting with some recreational drugs, they wrote "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." Many people thought, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, LSD. It's the way that the Beatles are telling their fans that they've been experimenting. But apparently that's a myth. John Lennon in an interview said no. He said, "My son brought home a drawing from nursery school of a little girl, Lucy, and in the sky, and it was diamonds, and this inspired him to write the song and to use that as the title of the song." So maybe it's nothing to do with drugs at all. In 1967, the Beatles created a BBC film, BBC television film, which was really not very good. It was put out at Easter, I remember it well, called Magical Mystery Tour. But the music was good. All the Beatles music is good. And one of the main songs for this film was John Lennon's I Am the Walrus. And the lyrics were absolutely nonsensical. But it didn't matter. The Beatles dressed up with funny heads on and recorded this on a video in a deserted airfield. And it became a famous video. A bit like Alice in Wonderland type of thing. And when asked why he wrote this, he said, well, because my fans or my critics have been analysing all the words that I write to songs, and he said I couldn't believe them doing this, so I thought I'd write some rubbish and see what they thought about that. So it was his way of getting back at his critics, saying, don't analyse my words, I just write what I want. The Rolling Stones were mates of the Beatles early on, back in the early 60s, and the Beatles wrote many songs for different people. They wrote for people like Cilla Black and Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, songs that they recorded themselves and put on an album or didn't record at all. And these were songs that got into the top 10. And legend has it that Paul McCartney and John Lennon were walking down a street in London and they bumped into the Stones. And the Stones said, look man, we need a record, we need a commercial song to get us into the charts. And John Lennon says, I've got one in my Mini. He said, I'll meet you in the cafe. And he went back, got this song. They went into the cafe, and John Lennon said, it's not finished yet, but hang on a minute while I just finish it. And the Stones looked on, great respect going on here. And they played the song, or they sang the song to the Stones and said, what do you think? And the Stones said, yeah, this is okay. I want to be your man. It sounds okay. The Stones went into the studio and they recorded it with Brian Jones playing slide guitar, and it became a hit for the Stones, the first real hit, but didn't go to number one. I think it got to about number 12. Was it true? Did they really bump into the Stones, or did the Stones bump into Paul and John in the road? And it's a great story, isn't it? I suspect it didn't happen like that, but who knows? It's a good story. So who broke up the Beatles? You read stories, you read biographies. Some people say it was John Lennon's idea. Some people say it was Paul McCartney's idea. I've read a lot of extracts from books and about this, and I'm pretty sure that John Lennon had the idea to do it and he wanted to do it, but Paul McCartney beat him to it. He wanted to plug his solo album, and he told the world's press, the Beatles are no more. And John Lennon was not very happy because I think he wanted to actually announce it, and he was beaten to it. Not a lot of people know that in 1968, when the Beatles were recording the White Album, the double album, that Ringo Starr quit. He walked out. He said, I'm unloved, nobody likes me. John, Paul and George, they're all very close-knit together and they don't like me. And he left. He walked out and he got on a plane and he flew to Sardinia. Peter Sellers lent him his yacht. And for 2 weeks he stayed on the yacht, and he actually wrote only his second song. He wrote Octopus's Garden while he was on this yacht. The Beatles carried on recording. Paul McCartney played the drums on 2 or 3 tracks, but they realised that they needed Ringo back. He's a good drummer, and they wanted him back. So they contacted him and said, look, we do love you. We're really sorry if you feel like this. Please come back. Ringo came back, and when he walked into the studio, the story goes that his drum kit was covered in flowers, and he sort of said, they do love me, and he stayed. Again, maybe the story is embellished, but it is true that he left, but it was never actually released to the press, and it was only later that the story came out. George Harrison, he basically was the guitarist in the band. he was happy to join the band. He was younger than Paul and John, and when he joined, he was just happy to be in the band. And he never really wrote early on. And Paul and John decided they were the songwriters, and they never encouraged George Harrison to write. Later on, he wrote some great songs. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Here Comes the Sun. He wrote some really good songs, but at the time when he did bring some songs in, Paul and John were not really, didn't really appreciate him. They weren't impressed with the songs. They allowed him one song on the early albums, and then later on they allowed him 2 songs. They helped him out. They helped him record the songs, and with their harmonies and what have you. But they never really rated him as a songwriter, which is a shame. And it is a fact that the Beatles only ever performed live one George Harrison song in the whole time together. And this was a song called If I Needed Someone, which they included on their 1966 tour, which I find it strange really, because George did write some good songs. It was widely reported that the Beatles bought a private island in Greece back in 1967, I think. The idea was that they wanted to get away from the screaming girls, and they wanted a bolt hole, a little piece of paradise where they could all live together with their partners and write songs, and everything would be fine. They sailed together in the Mediterranean, and they found this. They all agreed on this private island, and but they never bought it. They almost bought it. The negotiations went ahead, but they couldn't agree on the final contract, and they never actually bought it, although a lot of stories said they did. It was John's idea. He thought it'd be a great idea for them to have a place of their own. The Beatles in 1968 spent some time in the Himalayas with the Maharishi Yogi, a man who later turned out to be not exactly the person he claimed to be. But nevertheless, the Beatles loved his teachings. They liked the idea of meditation. It cleared their heads, and they could just do their hippie thing. They spent some time in the mountains, and it was during this time where George Harrison struck up a friendship with Donovan, who happened to be there. And Donovan was writing Hurdy-Gurdy Man at the time, which was his biggest hit, actually. It got into top 5. And George Harrison quite liked this song and said, George, I'll write you an extra verse. And he wrote this extra verse. Donovan took it into the studio, recorded it all, and the producer said, Donovan, it's too long. And this was the days when you could only have 3-minute songs. Anything over 3 minutes, nobody wanted to know. It was usually 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. So the producer said, you either ditch the lead guitar solo in the middle of the song, or you lose a verse. And Donovan decided not to use George Harrison's verse. But on tour, Donovan always makes a point of singing George Harrison's verse of Hurdy-Gurdy Man. And he makes a point of telling the audience that this is the verse that George Harrison wrote with me in the Himalayas. There are many, many stories about this. Too many. There's so many stories. But I hope it's given you some food for thought, and maybe you can help me out by putting some comments down there. Any stories you've heard, any stories that you think are true, not true. I know you've got to be of a certain age to actually know of the Beatles in the 60s. But if you're younger and you're just watching this video for whatever reason, I would listen to some of the early songs. Listen to the Rubber Soul album, listen to Revolver album, and you hear some fantastic songs. Speak to you again. Bye.